He thought silence was the only way to protect his mother. But that night, a stranger's voice was about to reveal everything he had failed to give her, and Adrian Romano stopped halfway down the dim hallway as something unfamiliar reached his ears, a soft, steady voice where there should have been nothing but guarded quiet, his jaw tightening as he turned toward the one place no one was ever allowed to enter. The door at the end of the corridor slightly open, warm light spilling onto the marble floor like a secret that had waited too long to be told. And for a moment he didn't move, because beneath that voice was another sound, fragile and uneven, his mother's voice, not angry, not distant, but confused, like someone searching for something she had lost years ago. And that alone was enough to make his chest tighten in a way no deal, no pressure, no power ever had. He stepped forward slowly, each footfall measured, controlled. But inside something was shifting, something he couldn't command or silence. And when he reached the doorway, he pushed it open just enough to see inside, expecting to find chaos, disobedience, a mistake that needed to be corrected immediately. But what he saw made him freeze mid-breath, because sitting on the polished wooden floor beside the bed was Lena Brooks, the quiet black maid who barely spoke above a whisper, her back straight, her hands gently wrapped around his mother's trembling fingers, her voice low and calm like it belonged in a place that had long forgotten peace. And his mother, his strong, once unshakable mother, was looking at her with a softness he hadn't seen in months, maybe years. "Tell me about your son," Lena said gently, not correcting her, not forcing reality, just inviting her into a memory that felt safe. And Adrian felt something twist in his chest as his mother smiled faintly, her eyes distant but warm, describing a little boy who used to wait by the door, who wanted nothing more than to be seen, to be held, to be told he mattered. And Adrian's fingers curled slightly at his side as he realized she wasn't talking about the empire or the man he had become, but the child he had buried beneath years of control and distance. And Lena listened without interrupting, nodding softly, her voice wrapping around the old woman's words like something steady, something real. "He must have been very lonely," she murmured, and the sentence landed heavier than anything Adrian had heard in years, not because it was loud, but because it was true in a way no one had ever dared to say out loud. And for the first time in his life, standing in his own home, surrounded by everything he had built, Adrian Romano realized he was the one on the outside of the room, watching someone else give his mother what he never could. Adrian did not step inside, not yet, because something in that room no longer belonged to him, and he could feel it in the way the air had softened, in the way his mother's voice no longer carried confusion, but something fragile and steady, like a memory she could finally hold without fear. And Lena remained exactly where she was, grounded and calm, her presence quiet but unshakable as she listened to every word as if it mattered, as if it was not just the rambling of an aging mind, but a story worth protecting. And Adrian realized with a slow, unfamiliar ache that he had not listened to his mother like that in years, not really listened, not without checking his watch or thinking about the next obligation waiting for him beyond those walls. And now a stranger was giving her something he had convinced himself could be replaced with comfort, with staff, with security, but it could not. It never could. And Lena gently adjusted her grip on the older woman's hands as she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost like a lullaby that did not belong to any song but carried the same rhythm of care. "Did he come back to you?" she asked quietly, and Adrian felt his breath catch because the question was not simple. It was not harmless, it carried weight, and his mother's eyes drifted for a moment before settling somewhere distant, somewhere only she could see. "He tried," she said slowly, her voice trembling but certain. "But he was always in a hurry, always somewhere else." And Adrian's chest tightened as if the words had found a place he had spent years avoiding, because he knew she was speaking about him, not as the man he had become, but as the son he had once been, the one who promised to stay, the one who promised to listen. And Lena did not interrupt. She did not correct. She did not defend him. She simply nodded as if she understood something deeper than what was being said. "Maybe he did not know how to stay," Lena replied gently, her tone free of judgment. And Adrian felt something shift inside him, something uncomfortable but undeniable, because for the first time, someone had not accused him, had not challenged his authority, but had seen the absence beneath it, the space where something important should have been, and his mother's fingers tightened slightly around Lena's hands, her expression softening further. "He was a good boy," she whispered. "He just forgot how to be one." And those words did not echo through the room. They settled into it, heavy and quiet, and Adrian found himself unable to move, unable to speak, because every instinct that had once defined him suddenly felt useless in a moment that required something else entirely, something he had never learned. And Lena leaned closer just slightly, her presence steady, offering not answers but space. "Do you think he can remember?" she asked, and the question hung there, not directed at Adrian, not meant for him, but somehow it reached him anyway. And his mother closed her eyes for a brief second before opening them again, her voice softer than before. "Only if someone shows him." "How?" she said, and Adrian felt that sentence settle deeper than anything else, because it was not a rejection, it was not a loss, it was a possibility, one he had never allowed himself to consider. And Lena smiled faintly, not triumphant, not proud, just quietly certain, as if she believed in something he had long stopped believing in. And Adrian finally stepped forward into the room, not with the authority that once filled every space he entered, but with something unfamiliar, something uncertain, and for the first time in his life, he did not know what to say, only that whatever came next could not be commanded, it had to be learned. Adrian's presence changed the room the moment he stepped inside, not because he spoke or raised his voice, but because silence followed him like it always had, heavy and commanding. Yet this time it did not settle the way it used to. It did not bend the space to his control, because Lena did not move. She did not stand up or step back. She simply turned her head slightly, as if acknowledging him, without surrendering the moment she had created. And his mother did not look at him the way she once would have, not with recognition or expectation, but with a distant curiosity, as if he were just another figure passing through her fading world. And that realization landed deeper than anything else had so far, because for the first time, Adrian was not the center of her attention. He was not even part of her understanding, and Lena's voice remained calm, steady, grounded in a way that seemed to anchor everything around it. "It is okay," she said softly, not to Adrian, but to the older woman. "You are safe." And those words carried a warmth that Adrian could not remember the last time he had offered, not like that, not without urgency or distraction. And his mother's shoulders eased just slightly, her grip on Lena's hand still firm but no longer trembling. And Adrian found himself standing there, unsure of where to place himself, unsure of how to enter a moment that was not built on his authority. And that uncertainty unsettled him more than any challenge ever had, because there was no strategy for this, no command that could restore what had been lost. And Lena looked up at him then, her eyes steady, not fearful, not defiant, simply present, as if she saw him not as the man everyone else feared, but as someone standing at the edge of something he did not understand. And she spoke quietly, her tone respectful but unshaken. "She remembers feelings more than facts," she said, and Adrian felt the words settle into him with a quiet weight, because they explained everything he had been doing wrong without accusing him directly. And he nodded once, almost automatically, though he was not sure what he was agreeing to, and his mother shifted slightly, her gaze drifting between them. "Who is he?" she asked softly, her voice carrying that same fragile confusion. And Adrian's chest tightened again, because he had prepared himself for many things in life, but not for being a stranger to the person who had once known him better than anyone else. And Lena did not rush to answer. She did not fill the silence too quickly. She simply turned back to the older woman, her voice gentle. "Someone who cares about you very much," she said. And Adrian felt something in that sentence both comfort and challenge him at the same time, because it was true in a way he had never expressed, and incomplete in a way he could not ignore. And his mother studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find something familiar beneath the surface. And Adrian did not move. He did not speak, because he did not know how to make her see him again. And Lena slowly released one of the older woman's hands and gestured slightly toward him, her movement calm, deliberate. "You can sit here," she said quietly, not as an order, not even as a suggestion, but as an invitation. And Adrian hesitated for a brief second before stepping forward, lowering himself into the chair beside the bed, closer than he had been in a long time, and the distance between them felt both small and impossible at the same time. And Lena resumed holding the older woman's hand, maintaining that connection while allowing space for something new to form. And Adrian looked at his mother, really looked at her, noticing the lines in her face, the softness that had replaced the sharp clarity he remembered, and he realized how much time had passed without him truly seeing her. And Lena spoke again, her voice guiding the moment without controlling it. "Sometimes it helps to speak from memory," she said gently. "Not to correct, just to connect." And Adrian let those words settle before he spoke, his voice quieter than it had ever been, unfamiliar even to himself. "You used to make pancakes every Sunday," he said slowly, choosing something simple, something real, and his mother's eyes flickered slightly, a faint spark of recognition passing through them, not full clarity, but something, and Lena nodded almost imperceptibly, encouraging without interrupting. And Adrian felt something shift inside him again, something fragile but real, because for the first time, he was not trying to fix the moment, he was trying to be in it, and that was something he had never learned how to do until now. The memory did not return all at once, it never did, but something in his mother's eyes lingered just a second longer than before, and that was enough to change the air in the room, because Adrian saw it, that faint flicker, that quiet recognition that did not fully form but refused to disappear, and it made his next breath feel heavier, more deliberate, as if every word he chose from that moment forward mattered in a way he had never considered before. And Lena remained still beside the bed, her presence steady but no longer leading, allowing space for something fragile to grow between mother and son. And Adrian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, lowering himself not just physically but emotionally into a place he had spent years avoiding. "You used to tell me I could not leave the table until I finished everything on my plate," he continued softly, his voice slower now, less certain but more real, and his mother's lips curved just slightly, not a full smile, but something close, something that belonged to a memory buried deep beneath confusion. "You hated vegetables," she murmured, her tone carrying a faint echo of familiarity, and Adrian let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, because that was the closest she had come to recognizing him. Not his name, not his face, but a shared moment. And Lena watched quietly, her eyes moving between them with careful attention, not interfering, only guiding with silence. And Adrian nodded, gently. "I still do," he admitted, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room softened into something almost normal, almost human, something untouched by time or illness. And his mother's gaze rested on him a little longer this time, studying him, searching, as if trying to connect the feeling she remembered to the man sitting in front of her. And Adrian held that gaze without looking away, without retreating behind the distance he had always used to protect himself. And Lena shifted slightly, her voice returning with quiet intention. "Feelings stay longer than names," she said softly, not directing the words at either of them specifically, but placing them gently into the moment like something that could be picked up if needed. And Adrian nodded again, slower this time, because he understood now that this was not about correcting her, not about forcing recognition, but about creating something she could hold on to without fear. And he glanced down at his hands briefly before looking back up, choosing his next words with care. "You used to wait for me by the door when I came home from school," he said, and his mother's expression changed again, her eyes softening as if that image lived somewhere inside her. "You were always late," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of something deeper, something that reached beyond the surface. And Adrian felt that sentence settle into him, not as an accusation, but as a truth he had never fully faced. And Lena's gaze shifted to him briefly, not judgmental, just aware, as if she recognized the weight of what had just been said. And Adrian swallowed quietly, his posture shifting just slightly. "I had a lot going on," he said instinctively, but the words felt empty the moment they left his mouth, and he stopped himself, his voice softening further. "But I should have come home sooner," he added, correcting himself not for her memory, but for his own. And his mother's hand moved slightly in Lena's grip, and then, slowly, she reached out toward Adrian, her fingers uncertain but intentional. And for a second he hesitated, not because he did not want to take her hand, but because he realized how long it had been since he had done something so simple, so unguarded. And then he leaned forward and placed his hand gently in hers, and the contact was light, almost fragile, but it was real, and his mother's fingers closed around his just enough to hold on, and Adrian felt something shift. Again, deeper this time, something that had nothing to do with power or control, and everything to do with presence. And Lena watched the moment quietly, her expression unchanged but her eyes softer, because she knew what was happening, even if Adrian did not have the words for it yet. And for the first time, sitting there beside the woman who had once known him better than anyone, Adrian was not trying to be understood, he was trying to understand, and that difference changed everything. The warmth of his mother's hand in his did not feel like a victory. It felt like something far more unsettling, because it was fragile, temporary, and entirely dependent on something he did not control, and Adrian realized in that quiet moment that this was not about reclaiming what he had lost. It was about earning something he had never truly given, and Lena slowly loosened her grip, allowing the connection between them to exist without her holding it together. Yet she did not step away. She remained close, watching with a kind of calm awareness that made Adrian feel both guided and exposed at the same time. And his mother tilted her head slightly as she studied his face again, her fingers still resting lightly in his. "You look tired," she said softly, and the simplicity of the observation caught him off guard, because it was not tied to memory, not to confusion. It was present, real, and for a moment he almost laughed at how accurate it was, not just physically, but in a way that reached deeper than that, and he nodded faintly. "I have been busy," he replied, but even as he said it, the words felt distant, like something he used to believe mattered more than it did now, and his mother's gaze softened further. "You always were," she whispered, and that sentence lingered between them, not harsh, not accusing, just true, and Adrian felt it settle into a place he could not ignore, because for the first time he understood that being busy had not just taken him away from the world, it had taken him away from her, from moments like this that could not be scheduled or replaced. And Lena shifted slightly, her voice gentle as she spoke again. "You can stay in the feeling longer if you do not rush it," she said, and Adrian glanced at her briefly, not defensive, not resistant, but curious, because he realized she was not instructing him as a servant would, she was guiding him as someone who understood something he did not, and he nodded slowly, turning his attention back to his mother, choosing not to fill the silence too quickly, choosing instead to remain in it. And after a few seconds, his mother's thumb moved faintly against his hand, a small, unconscious gesture, but it carried a familiarity that made his chest tighten again, and he leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice. "Do you remember the park by the lake?" he asked, and her eyes flickered again, not fully clear, but searching. "There were ducks," she said uncertainly, and Adrian's lips curved into the faintest smile, because that was enough, that small fragment, that piece of a shared memory that had survived everything else. "You used to bring bread every Saturday morning," he continued, and this time her expression shifted more noticeably, a soft recognition blooming slowly. "You would chase them," she said, and Adrian let out a quiet breath, something almost like relief settling into him, because she was there, not completely, not perfectly, but present in a way that felt real. And Lena watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, not pride, not ownership, just a steady belief in the process unfolding exactly as it should. And Adrian realized something else in that moment, something that changed the way he looked at her, because she had not forced this, she had not fixed it, she had simply created the space where it could happen, and that required something he had never valued before. Patience, and he turned his head slightly toward her, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. "How did you know what to say?" he asked, and Lena met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm but deeply rooted in something personal. "Because I had to learn it the hard way," she replied softly, and Adrian studied her for a second longer, sensing there was more beneath that answer, something she was not offering yet, and he did not press, not this time, because he was beginning to understand that some things were not taken, they were given when the moment was right. And his mother shifted again, her grip loosening slightly as her attention drifted, but Adrian did not pull away. He stayed exactly where he was, holding on just enough, present in a way he had never been before, and for the first time, he did not think about how long the moment would last. He only focused on the fact that it was happening at all. The room had grown quieter, not because the sounds had disappeared, but because something inside Adrian had shifted enough to finally hear them differently. The soft rhythm of his mother's breathing, the faint rustle of fabric as she adjusted against the pillows, and the steady presence of Lena beside them, grounding everything without ever demanding attention. And for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to fill the silence with instructions or decisions. He simply sat there, letting the moment unfold at its own pace. And his mother's eyes began to drift again, her focus loosening as the fragile thread of memory started to slip. But Adrian did not react with urgency the way he might have before. He did not call for assistance or try to correct her, because something Lena had said lingered in his mind. That feeling stayed longer than facts, and so he stayed with her, not chasing clarity, but holding presence. And Lena watched him carefully, her expression calm but attentive, as if she were observing not just his actions, but the subtle changes beneath them. And after a moment, she spoke again, her voice low enough not to disrupt the space. When the memory fades, you do not pull it back. You follow where it goes, she said gently, and Adrian turned slightly toward her, absorbing the meaning behind the words, realizing that everything he had been doing before had been an attempt to control something that required surrender instead, and he nodded slowly. Then looked back at his mother, who now seemed distant again, her gaze no longer focused on him but not entirely lost either, just somewhere in between. And Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, loosening his posture, allowing himself to mirror the calm Lena carried so naturally. And after a few seconds, his mother spoke again, her voice softer now, almost like a whisper carried by memory rather than intention. "It is getting dark," she said, though the room was still lit with warm afternoon light, and Adrian felt a brief instinct to correct her, to remind her of the time. But he stopped himself, remembering what Lena had said, and instead he followed her words. "Do you want me to turn on the porch light?" he asked gently, and Lena's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment, a quiet acknowledgment passing between them. Because he had understood, he had chosen connection over correction, and his mother's lips curved slightly. "Yes," she whispered, and Adrian nodded, even though there was no actual porch light to turn on in that moment, because it was not about the light, it was about the feeling of being cared for. And he reached over and adjusted the lamp beside her bed, dimming it just enough to match the softness of her perception, and the room seemed to settle again, not into silence, but into something more balanced, more human. And Lena shifted her position slightly, easing the tension in her shoulders, her presence still steady, but now more relaxed, as if she could feel the shift happening not just in Adrian's actions, but in his understanding. And after a moment, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "You said you learned this the hard way," he said, glancing at her briefly. And Lena held his gaze for a second, then looked down at her hands, her fingers resting loosely together as if holding on to something unseen. "My mother forgot me too," she said softly, and the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that did not need elaboration. And Adrian felt something in his chest tighten again, not from shock, but from recognition, because now he understood that her calm was not natural. It was earned, shaped by experience he had never considered. And Lena continued, her voice steady but touched with something deeper. "I used to try to make her remember who I was. I thought if I said the right thing, showed her the right pictures, she would come back." She paused briefly, her eyes lifting again, but all it did was make her more afraid. And Adrian listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, because for once, he understood that this was not something to be fixed, it was something to be felt. And Lena's gaze softened slightly as she looked toward his mother. "So I stopped trying to bring her back to me," she said quietly. "And I started meeting her where she was." And Adrian let those words settle deeply, because they explained everything he had just experienced, everything he had been missing. And he looked at his mother again, not as someone he needed to restore, but as someone he needed to reach, right where she was. And for the first time, that felt possible. Adrian did not speak right away after Lena's words settled into the room, because for once he understood that silence was not emptiness, it was space, and space was something he had never allowed himself to give, not to his mother, not to anyone. And now that he did, something within it began to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt deeper than anything he had built outside these walls. And his gaze returned to his mother, who sat there with a quiet stillness, her eyes drifting between moments only she could see. And instead of trying to bring her back, Adrian leaned slightly closer, lowering himself into her world the way Lena had shown him. "It is okay," he said softly, echoing the same calm tone he had heard earlier, and his mother's shoulders eased again, not because she recognized him, but because she recognized the feeling, and that realization settled into Adrian with a quiet weight. Because for the first time, he understood that being known was not always about identity. Sometimes it was about presence, and Lena remained beside them, her hands resting gently in her lap now, no longer guiding directly, but watching with quiet certainty as Adrian began to move through something he had never been taught. And after a moment, his mother spoke again, her voice faint but steady. "You stayed this time," she said, and Adrian's chest tightened instantly, because he knew she was not speaking about this exact moment. She was speaking from somewhere deeper, somewhere tied to years he could not undo. And he swallowed slowly, his voice quieter than before. "I am here now," he replied, and Lena's eyes flickered toward him for just a second, not to evaluate, but to acknowledge. Because she understood what that sentence meant, not as a correction of the past, but as a commitment to the present, and his mother's gaze rested on him again, not fully clear, but softer than before. "Do not leave so fast," she whispered, and Adrian felt something in him shift completely, because there was no defense for that, no explanation that could make it lighter, and for the first time, he did not try to justify anything. He did not explain, he did not redirect, he simply nodded slowly. "I will not," he said, and the words felt unfamiliar, not because they were difficult to say, but because he had never meant them the way he did now. And Lena watched quietly, her expression unchanged but her presence still grounding the moment, because she knew that what was happening was not something she could create, only something she could allow. And Adrian leaned back slightly, still holding his mother's hand, but no longer gripping it with uncertainty. Now it felt more natural, more steady, as if something had aligned within him. And after a few seconds, he turned his head toward Lena again, his voice low, carrying something that had not been there before, not authority, not command, but sincerity. "You did not just help her," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "You showed me something I did not even know I was missing." And Lena met his gaze, her eyes calm but carrying a depth that reflected everything she had shared. "It is not something you are missing," she replied softly. "It is something you were never given enough of." And Adrian absorbed that quietly, because he knew she was right, not as an excuse, but as a truth, and that truth did not weaken him. It clarified something he had spent years building around, and he looked back at his mother once more, not with urgency, not with pressure, but with a kind of patience that felt new and unfamiliar. And for the first time, he did not measure the moment by what it could become, he measured it by what it already was, something real, something present, something that did not require control to exist. And as the light in the room softened slightly with the passing hour, Adrian remained exactly where he was, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that choice, simple as it seemed, carried more weight than anything he had commanded in his entire life. The light in the room had shifted into a softer glow, the kind that made time feel slower, less demanding, and Adrian noticed it without looking at the clock, because for once he was not measuring the moment by minutes or obligations waiting outside the door. He was measuring it by the quiet rhythm of his mother's breathing and the steady warmth of her hand in his, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to hold his full attention. And Lena remained nearby, no longer guiding with words, but with presence, allowing the space to belong to him now. And his mother's eyes fluttered slightly as if she were drifting between waking and memory, her grip loosening just enough to signal the shift. And Adrian did not react with urgency. He did not call for assistance or try to anchor her back. Instead, he adjusted his posture gently, keeping his hand beneath hers, steady but not forcing connection. And after a moment, she spoke again, her voice softer, almost carried by a place far away. "Did you eat today?" she asked, And Adrian felt something catch in his chest because the question was so simple, so ordinary, yet it carried a care he had not allowed himself to receive in years. And he nodded faintly, though he was not sure if it was true. Not yet, he admitted quietly, and his mother's expression shifted just slightly, concern passing through her features in a way that felt real despite everything else fading. "You should not forget," she murmured, and Adrian felt the weight of those words in a way that went beyond food, because he understood now that forgetting had been the pattern of his life, forgetting moments, forgetting presence, forgetting the people who had once waited for him. And Lena's gaze rested on him briefly, not pressing, just acknowledging the realization settling in, and Adrian let out a slow breath, his voice lower now. "I forget a lot," he said, not as an excuse, but as a truth he was only now willing to face, and his mother's fingers moved slightly. Again, a faint squeeze that felt more instinct. Then intention. "Then remember this," she whispered, and Adrian leaned in slightly, his attention sharpening without tension. "You are not alone," she added, and the sentence landed deeper than anything else she had said, because even in her fragmented state, she was offering something he had not known he needed, and Adrian closed his eyes briefly, not to escape the moment, but to feel it fully, because he understood now that these fragments were not random. They were reflections of something, still intact beneath the surface. And when he opened his eyes again, Lena was watching him, her expression calm, but carrying a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. And he spoke again, his voice steady but changed. "I used to think taking care of someone meant providing everything they needed," he said slowly. "But I never realized I was missing the one thing that actually mattered." And Lena nodded faintly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because she had walked that path before. And Adrian turned his attention back to his mother, who now seemed more at ease, her breathing slower, her expression softer, and he adjusted the blanket lightly over her shoulders, not out of obligation, but out of awareness, and the small gesture felt more meaningful than any grand action he had taken before, and Lena shifted her weight slightly, preparing to step back further, sensing that the moment no longer required her presence as closely. But before she could move, Adrian spoke again, his voice quiet but certain. "Stay," he said, not as a command, but as a request, and Lena paused, meeting his gaze for a second, seeing the difference in him clearly now, and she nodded once, remaining where she was, not because she had to, but because he had finally learned how to ask, and the room settled into a quiet stillness once more. But this time it was not empty. It was full of something new, something Adrian had never created before, and as he sat there, holding his mother's hand, with a calm he did not recognize as his own, he realized that everything he had built outside this room had never required him to change. But this moment did, and for the first time, he did not resist it. The room did not change all at once, but something in it had settled into a quiet truth that could no longer be ignored, and Adrian remained seated beside his mother long after the moment should have passed, long after the world outside would have expected him to move on, to return to the life that demanded his attention. But for once, he did not feel that pull, because everything he needed to understand was right there in the fragile rise and fall of her breathing and the faint warmth of her hand resting in his. And Lena stood a few feet away now, not distant, but no longer central, her presence shifting from guide to witness as she watched the final shape of the moment form without her interference. And Adrian looked at his mother again, really looked at her, not as someone fading, but as someone still reaching in the only way she could, and he leaned in slightly, his voice quieter than it had ever been, not because he was unsure, but because he finally understood the power of softness. "I am here," he said again, not to remind her, but to anchor himself, and his mother's eyes opened just enough to meet his, not fully clear, not fully present, but carrying a calm that had not been there before, and she studied him for a brief second as if searching for something deeper than recognition, something that lived beneath names and memories. And then, slowly, her expression softened into something that felt unmistakably real, and her fingers moved just slightly against his hand, not gripping, not reaching, just acknowledging, and Adrian felt that small movement travel through him in a way nothing else ever had, because it was not something he had commanded, it was something he had earned. And Lena watched the exchange with a quiet stillness, her eyes reflecting a kind of understanding that did not need to be spoken, because she had seen this moment before, not in this room, not with these people, but in the quiet spaces where presence finally replaced control. And Adrian exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as if something he had carried for years had finally loosened its hold, and he turned his head slightly toward Lena, his voice steady but carrying something deeper now, something that did not come from authority, but from recognition. "I thought I knew what it meant to take care of someone," he said, and Lena held his gaze without interrupting, allowing him to find the rest of the sentence on his own. "But I never understood what it meant to stay," he finished, and the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not heavy, not overwhelming, just true, and Lena nodded once, her expression unchanged but her eyes softer, because she knew that understanding could not be taught, it could only be realized. And Adrian looked back at his mother once more, adjusting the blanket lightly around her shoulders again, not because it was needed, but because it was something he chose to do, something simple that carried intention, and his mother's eyes closed slowly, not in confusion this time, but in rest, her breathing steady, her expression peaceful in a way he had not seen in a long time. And Adrian did not move. He did not pull his hand away. He remained exactly where he was, allowing the quiet to exist without interruption. And after a moment, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper, not directed at her, not directed at Lena, but something that existed between them. "Thank you," he said, and the words were not grand, they were not elaborate, but they carried a sincerity that made them heavier than anything else he had said before. And Lena inclined her head slightly, not accepting praise, but acknowledging the moment, because she understood that gratitude was not for her alone, it was for what had been uncovered. And Adrian sat there for a while longer, not counting the time, not thinking about what came next, because for the first time, he was not ahead of the moment, he was inside it. And as the light in the room dimmed further into evening, something within him had already shifted beyond return, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would follow